Hey everybody, welcome back to All Things MSP Office Hours. This is the second in our two-part series with Eureka Process on how to create a culture of process in your business. Now, last time we started with the process, not the procedure, don't call it that. Call it the process. Now, we walked through a couple of pieces of documentation, some ways that you can do that, some important components that you could use to start creating that process. And now today, we're going to finalize that with now taking that process and creating that culture of process in your business. So of course, with me today, I have Alan Edwards from Eureka Process to walk us through this next step. And really, I think probably you got to have one to have the other. So they're both important, but this is the key component to making it matter for your employees, which is where we really need to take this because of that leaky bucket syndrome that we talked about in the last one.
Absolutely. And again, Eric, thanks for having me back. I feel a little bit low-key attacked when you said the procedure. I love it. Thanks for teasing me. So when I'm working with our clients, we spend a lot of time creating processes, and then sometimes there's still failure at the end of the tunnel. I'm not scared of the word failure, right? I fail all the time. It's as long as you don't quit and you keep trying, it doesn't stick. And so that last key component, the thing that you must do to make the culture shift, is implement your coaching system. And there's a couple of key components I want to review today about what this coaching system means. So I feel like there's 3 layers of process. And more importantly, there's only 2 ways to mess up in a business. As working in the business, only 2 ways to mess up. Failure to live up to core values and a failure to follow processes. And this is where the 3 layers become important. So I'm sure we've all heard about core values. I'm actually quite passionate about teaching core values. And one day maybe we can do a workshop on that because I love it. Core values is a big part of the identity of your business. If I may be so bold, you can almost compare it to, why one church over another church. What does that church believe in? What types of people does that community attract? And your business is much the same way. People want to stay where they fit in, where they share beliefs and values. And that's why it's so important to define that core value. When I say people, I mean not just employees, but clients, vendors.
Yeah.
It makes the world go round, and it's really important. And even with well-defined and discussed core values, it can still be unclear how those behaviors look like to match those core values. And that's why we came up with the Ways to Succeed middleware. It helps connect behaviors to core values. So in our Ways to Succeed document, I have such tropes as, if it's not in your PSA, it didn't happen. And with explanations about how that relates to our core values. And that's really where the science comes in to making this stick. Same with, if it's not in your documentation system, it doesn't exist. I have some other ones. Another one that I like is admit mistakes. It's one of our ways to succeed. So we acknowledge the fact that we make mistakes and that most mistakes don't typically get you fired, right? If you admit them, we can head off any problems and we can learn from them. It's when people don't admit those mistakes that both those things become at jeopardy and start to violate our core values. Is there one more I can share with you? Oh, I love this one. Ask questions.
Yeah.
But not before you've referenced documentation. And so we've built 9 to 13 ways to succeed with some points, some practical examples about behavior. And it keeps me from having to repeat those needs in every process that I write as well.
So you kind of have these values, and then you have the behaviors that map to those values, right? And then you have the processes to give you the technical pieces of how to actually follow those. Does that?
Yeah, that roughly matches. So let's pick a very common example of a technician working a ticket. Let's even forget the technical solution of the ticket, but how to work a ticket. Like, hey, you're supposed to grab the ticket, put it in progress, and do these steps. If those steps aren't followed, what I expect is a manager to come to that technician and go, hey, you didn't follow our process. Because remember, there's only two ways to mess up: failure to follow a process or not live up to core values. And there's could be some positive answers to this, by the way. The tech might come back like, hey, I made a core values decision because of these extenuating circumstances. And if that holds up, great, thank you. Maybe we should look at the process. Or maybe for some of us who are tuning in with bated breath on this particular series, right? It's, I don't have that process. Well, guess what? Your technician's not in trouble. Instead, you're still going to have a conversation about process, but it's writing it. And even if you just start with a couple of bullet points to start it, that's what we want to do. Because we're always going to pull it back to process. And that's why all three of those layers are so important. I work with a lot of clients who want to start with process first, and that is okay. But what happens inevitably is after 3 to 6 months, I'm like, okay, now we need to back up and add core values so we have this overarching umbrella for what's happening. Another way to look at core values, it's the ultimate process. Because if I have an employee who did a behavior, and maybe it's not the same behavior I would have done, but if I really evaluated the core values and they were on track, meaning they lived up to our core values, I don't have a whole lot to say, but yeah, let's get this process in place so we can be more clear about this. Likewise, if you don't have a process and they misbehaved in something that violates the core value, you still can have a conversation about how to correct that behavior. And that's why all three of these things have to work together.
Yeah, and that makes sense to me. And it's funny because I've actually been reading a book recently. It's Business Made Simple by Donald Miller. And they talk about how to create your core values and how to create some of these behaviors that, map to those core values. One of the obvious ones that he mentions it in a lot of retail or in fast food restaurant, you'll have people when customers walk in the door, one of the behaviors that they can always do is shout, welcome to Five Guys or, whatever it is. And so that's kind of, the thing you're trying to get here. The other thing that I wanted to kind of point or pull out a little bit was, building processes in the absence of core values, in the absence of behaviors, you're kind of doing it in the dark, right? And one of the things that I really liked about what we talked about in the last episode, and of course people will have to go back and watch it now, is to really, while you're doing this, you talked about the importance of testing these processes, especially when we got to the asset piece of it last time. And you really have to do that testing of these processes of how do they match the core values? How do they match the behaviors? In addition to them just being technically correct.
Oh, absolutely. When it comes to especially core values and ways to succeed, this doesn't have to be a hard exercise to do that testing. Core values is one of those few times that while I want some feedback from my team, this really does come from the core of the organization as well, which would be leadership. And some of the ways we extract core values in their clients is having them, identify their ideal employee and understand their personality traits. Those might give you a clue to the types of things that you value. So having these three things defined, or at least understood, there's only two ways to mess up. We can then apply our coaching system. Now, the coaching system itself is not rocket science, as so many things that we teach aren't. It's just you have to have a system of escalation to make sure you're actually coaching them and holding them accountable to process. So let's take a practical, we won't get into too many details. Let's be practical about this. First lap, something happens. As I mentioned, you grab them and you remind them about the written process or the core value. There is no, hey, don't forget. You have to pull them back to the written documentation of the process. Same time, second lapse, retraining. Okay, now you have to pull them back. You have to have it on the screen. You have to walk them through it, ask them questions, help them understand. Before you move into things that seem a little more disciplinary, like getting a verbal one, like, hey, I'm going to show you this again, because I know it takes some time to adopt new behaviors, but this is becoming a problem. Before you get into the written warning, it's like, okay, now this is serious enough that I have to put this in writing that this is a problem. And then that fifth time, probation, I like doing something like 90 days, 90 days of perfection regarding the one area of problem you're having. And I typically, even in our process, if you have middle management, I was like, okay, your boss's boss has to get involved at the probation step so they know that it's serious. I even read a letter, and the letter does say termination is the most likely next step. I hate termination. I hate talking about it. But they need to know it's serious. And ultimately, you have to act. Now, I confess this is part art and part science. There are times to make an exception. And I wrote in our book, Process and the Other P Word, a couple of examples. But like, if you've never made an exception before for this person, and it hasn't been about the same thing, maybe this is the time to do it, and that's okay. But the idea is exceptions have to be exactly that, exceptions, not the rule. I make it a habit of writing down each of these issues. I use OneNote for doing our quarterly reviews with our team. I write down issues. I also write down positives, by the way. If a client says something wonderful about one of my team, I write it down so I can bring it up, let them know that I thought about it. I mean, I've already broadcasted to the whole team, and I also remind them, quarterly review, hey, this great thing happened. And how are you doing on this retraining we did regarding this one knowledge base we talked about? Has it come up since? Do we have any issues? I haven't noticed any, so that's great. Things like that, and that's the coaching system. And since we brought up a really ugly word, termination, or promotion to another employer, quality time with the missus or the mister, I get this one objection a lot from my clients. Hey, they've gone through all 6 steps for the 18th time. Most of the violations were even core values, and they're terrible people. But I can't afford to lose this person. Well, I obviously always answer with, are you sure? Have you ever noticed the phenomenon that when you let somebody go, suddenly everybody comes out of the woodworks to thank you for it? Like, oh, and then you're finding all the other stuff that you weren't seeing because they were still there. I have never, in the entire history of my career, and I've fired or asked people to fire many, 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 many people in my life, no one has ever regretted it. They've dreaded it. They feel bad for the person involved, but they haven't regretted the positive impact to their team. So I came up with this, again, not so empirical survey, this looking at what I've seen happen. When you really start to push a coaching system, right? So you build your processes, you create your core values, you start managing to those processes, you start recording issues. Because this is new to you, there's a good chance you've been pulling some dead weight. Because you haven't shown them what your culture is like yet. They don't know if they belong or not. And as soon as you start saying, no, this is our culture, they might either self-select or you might have to ask them to leave. But I have found the ratio of 80-10-10 is applicable, meaning 80% of your people are going to step right up and say, thank you for setting expectations so clearly that I can do my job. You must care about me. The 10% in group C there are going to fight you tooth and nail on this. And you have to take that 5th or 6th step with them. You have to. Or you're going to lose group B as well. It's that simple. I've seen it time and time again. I actually have a story. I had 2 tier 3 engineers when I was a service manager that I had difficulty managing. And everybody complained to me about them. But they were our tier 3 engineers. What would we ever do? We can't afford to lose them. This is actually when I invented this system to try to prove to my owners that I have done everything in my power to save this relationship. Uh, and as we got to step 5, they both quit in the same day. And that afternoon, everybody came to my office and thanked me and volunteered to do whatever it took to fill in the gap, which turns out wasn't much
Yeah.
because their failure to follow processes were creating extra work for everybody else.
Yeah. And really, if you think about it, it's switching that sentence around, right? It's, can you afford not to get rid of these people? A lot of times, because they do create extra work. They create drama. They bring everything down, and the efficiencies that you gain by either correcting it or by removing the problem will, create the results that you're looking for.
On the positive side of this equation, I've had some folks in Group C who fought me tooth and nail, and I give them every due credit to handle their exceptions, to work with them, and those that have turned around, which is many, became our biggest evangelists. Like, yeah, process is great after all. I was against it the first 6 months, but now I really see the benefits. So there's a positive outcome to this, and that's why I'm speaking so strongly about those final steps. It's scary to think about terminating somebody, but if it becomes real in their mind that this is how important it is to you, and in your mind that that's what you're willing to do to obtain this culture, you probably don't need to do it.
Well, and that's the thing, right? I've been in lots of situations where I had employees who were, I'm going to call them laggards, right? And it's because we didn't have the proper expectations set. As soon as I put expectations in place, they improved immediately. And
Right.
by the way, that also includes the expectations of, if we go through step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and they're not improving, you've already set the expectations far in advance of what's going to happen. And so it's
Now,
not a surprise to anybody when you get to the end of the process and you got to say, sorry, we're promoting you to your next employer, as you put it, so eloquently before.
that actually leads me to a caveat. And this is a little bit of psychological warfare on my part. This coaching system, I do not broadcast to my team. I walk softly and carry a big stick, because when you start making exceptions, there's a huge perception issue there that you're inconsistent or favoritism. So what I do instead is I keep this process on the DL or in management, and I show them through actions. Now, yes, if they're on step 1, no big deal. As they get to step 3, you might mention, hey, this is what I see as the next step for you. There's also times to skip steps if it's a big enough problem, which is why I don't broadcast the system at large. Plus, it sounds like you're counting mistakes, which is not our intention. And that's why we allow for some exceptions. We want a progressive policy that allows re-education and training and mistakes to happen, but without it being a big demoralizing deal. And at the same time, we need the power to show them how serious we are about our culture.
Right. Well, and yes, I can agree with that. I guess in my mind, I'm setting the expectation for the next step, not laying the whole process out from the beginning.
Well, that was a good topic for us to discuss anyways. I felt highly enough about it to write that in the book as well. Because they started going, well, he has 4 infractions and I have 2. That's not what this is about.
Right, right. And actually, I do now remember reading that in the book, because it was a little bit contrary until I thought it all the way through. It was a little contrary to my initial thought.
And as there's a lot of things that I say, and I even conflict myself because there's always 2 sides to every story, and I feel they're both important to be heard. So, speaking of 2 sides, I'm a little depressed talking about terminations, even though it's a good, passionate reason. I have a fun slide for you. I think it's fun. Maybe it's a little geeky to be fun. So some of these process names that I've had, like the process, or formerly the procedure you teased me about. Names do matter. When I first created Ways to Succeed, it was 10 ways not to get fired. And yes, I posted it on the door of our service room like Martin Luther did when he separated from the church. It was kind of a dick move on my part. Right? This is why we get older and smarter, if we get older. And so eventually I was, okay, it's not ways not to get fired. It's a dirty word. We'll call it the 10 Commandments. Well, then I had issues with it. Sometimes it's 9, sometimes it's 13, depending on where I was applying it at. And commandments were still kind of strong. So I found the positive way to say it, Ways to Succeed. And that was several years in iteration to come up with a positive name. But words are important. They set the tone. They're part of that culture, that way of behaving. By emulating positive words, you get more positive things happening. One more example of the same is this was originally the discipline process. And we did a little more than just change the name. We're like, wait a minute, why do we start with a negative? What do we do with the retraining part? Because they say it takes 7 times before somebody hears you the first time for a change. So we wanted to, even when we're introducing new processes, we always talk about, sending it out in email, covering it in detail in a meeting, reviewing it in other meetings, reviewing it in our one-on-ones, before we start to enforce that piece of the coaching system. So names are important, which leads me to one more fun thing. Sarcasm. I love sarcasm. And it seems to be twice as rampant in the IT field. I think it's because sarcasm is actually a highly intelligent form of humor, kind of like dad jokes are, and puns and such. And as much as I love sarcasm, I have found that it's not great for culture. Even if you want to say that our kidding humor is great, especially as you expand and include more people, not everybody sees it that way, no matter how bad you want that. And so just keeping things positive at all times, including in how you name your processes and policies, is important too. Call that a bonus episode. So this was our journey in this 2-part series, right? Step 1, get started. Write the process. And for those of you who watched part 1, we posted that with a link to the actual template you can copy and paste and use for yourself. So that's the process. Just get it started. Don't overthink it. So many of us IT types want it to be perfect, or think we know better. And maybe you do, but I'd rather you get it done than get it perfect. You can always iterate on it later and make it perfect the way you want. Copy and paste it, fill in the variables, move on for the meantime.
Yeah, that's something that I struggled with. Was I always wanted to design something great, and then I ran out of time to actually do it.
Yeah, or you begin to feel like it's a burden, so you don't do anything else ever like it again. That happens to me sometimes. And then the last half of the previous episode, we talked about documenting more of our decisions, such as the device naming standards and password naming standards, client assets. Even the coaching system is something you can document as a decision on how you want to work. Apologize for my phone ringing. And then this webinar, which is manage to the documentation. If you don't do that piece, culture will not shift. You've done all the work and gotten none of the benefits without the last piece. And thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Yeah. My Eric Talk. Sorry, you're not Ted.
That's all right. I've been called Ted before. I don't know why, but it's happened. Anyway, so I wanted this to be one of the early office hours simply because this is so important to a service business. Because if you don't standardize on how that service is delivered, and that'll be my cue to switch to the interview 2 up. There we go. If you don't deliver it consistently, you're going to have problems. You're going to have problems with your people. You're going to have problems with your clients. So building these processes, creating the standardization, Creating the consistency is what is going to help you drive efficiency as well as satisfaction, in my opinion.
I mean, people are satisfied with McDonald's because it's consistent, even though it's not great. And yes, I know we all want to be great, and a lot of you probably are already great, but consistency solves a lot of problems while you're working on being great. Because even if you're consistently good, you're going to retain clients while you continue to improve great. And plus, if you have a culture of process and then you improve your process and make it better, your people will change with it because that's your culture. Versus, why won't they adapt with me?
Well, and it comes down to a word that we've used several times in these past two sessions, and that is expectations, right? If your clients know what to expect, they're not going to be disappointed if you're delivering on it consistently. It may not be great yet, but it's consistent and they know what to expect, so they're not disappointed. Where you run into problems is when they start becoming disappointed in the service that you're delivering.
Yeah, I mean, great quick example, client onboarding. I love to do a little dog and pony show when we're on site the first time and entertaining a few folks. We always give the announcement, hey, our team is doing some documentation, some quick touch-ups while we're here. It's not our part of our plan, but there might be disruptions. And we apologize in advance. Please bear with us and report it to us. We're here in the building. And while that almost never happens, it has before. We have set expectations. And then when we exceed those, great. And that's 80% of the time. And every now and then it happens, but they expected it. It's no big deal.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, Alan, any last tips that you can give people on how to get started building a culture of process in their business?
I hate to give this with an apology, but we do have a community site, theeurekacommunity.com. It's a small paid-for subscription. I don't like the user interface on it myself, but all of our templates are there. And if you want a different approach, our book, Process and the Other P Word, which is also process, does come with access to the 4 templates we talk about that you can download and copy and paste that way as well.
Awesome. And of course, one of the things that people struggle with anytime when they're trying to build this, especially as a busy business owner, is accountability. So if they want to engage you in Eureka Process, how do they do that?
EurekaProcess.com. My Calendly link is right there. Glad to talk with you to see if there's a problem we can solve for you. And it's not always a yes, and we'll let you know either way.
Awesome. Well, Alan, thank you very much for contributing to this, what I think is a very important office hours. And everybody, we'll see you in the next one. Have a great day.
Office hours are closed.